Good afternoon, and welcome to the third and the last session of the Strategic High Tide in the Indo-Pacific, Economics, Ecology, and Security. We've had two sessions starting yesterday morning, and the session that we are all part of is environmental concerns and engagements in this part of the world. We have 90 minutes at our disposal for this session. My name is Anurag Tanda. I am a Senior Visiting Fellow at ORF. I am based out of Kolkata and part of the ORF Kolkata team. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you and the speakers in particular. Those who are to my east, good evening to you. Those who are to my west, a very good morning to you. You need not introduce yourself. I'll do the honors for you. I'll start with Dr. Anthony Borgen. In terms of seniority, I think that's only proper. He's a senior fellow with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, an independent think tank in Australia. He is a former deputy director of the institute and the research director. Dr. Borgen has served as an academic at the Australian Defence Force Academy, teaching military officers and cadets. We have Ashley Johnson joining in from nearabouts Washington, I guess. A very good morning to you. She's the Director for Energy and Environmental Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Incidentally, we have a few of our speakers with current or former NBR affiliations. She manages and oversees NBR's initiatives on energy security, environmental sustainability, and economic development. We have Dr. David Brewster, a senior research fellow with the National Security College, Australian National University, and he's one of the leading experts in Australia on security in the Indian Ocean region, and including geo-environmental security issues. He has books to his credit, India as an Asia-Pacific Power, which is about India's strategic role in the Asia-Pacific, as well as India's Ocean, the story of India's bid for regional leadership, which examines India's strategic ambitions in the region, in the Indian Ocean region. From Singapore, we have Julius, who's joined in. He's a research fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the NTU in Singapore. He conducts policy research studies and has several publications to his name, and he's particularly interested in marine environmental protection in Southeast Asia. We are also joined by Dr. Nilanthi Samaranaike, also from the Washington region, so a very good morning to you. She's the director of the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at CNA. Her analysis has been widely published in journals such as the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, Hindustan Times, and Defense One, amongst various others. She's the lead author of Raging Waters, China, India, Bangladesh, and Brahmaputra River Politics. This was in 2018. And before joining CNA in 2010, she completed a fellowship at the NBR. So that's the second person with former affiliation. And we have Ambassador Tariq Karim. Fortunately, he's now visiting in India, and therefore in the same time band that I am in. So, sir, a very good afternoon to you. He's currently the director of Center for Bay of Bengal Studies. He's the former ambassador to India from Bangladesh, and he was a very high-ranking diplomat at that. He was the lead negotiator on behalf of Bangladesh when the Ganges Treaty was being negotiated. And just before the program, as I was introducing myself to all of you. I said Sundarbans is an area that I'm interested in. Ambassador Karim is very supportive of it and passionate about the region as well. And of course, he also serves on the advisory board of the National Bureau of Asian Research. So that's the third person with an NBR affiliation. Welcome to all of you. The way we will go about this is each one of you will have about 8 minutes to make your presentation, your argument. And the way this session has been conceived is essentially keeping in mind the challenges that are faced in the Indo-Pacific region because of the environmental changes. And of course, when I say environmental changes, it is, though the Glasgow COP is on, it is not restricted to climate change, global warming and climate change. We could also be looking at other anthropogenic changes that have been brought about, particularly in river flows, sediment flows, groundwater usage. So essentially, there are a number of environmental governance challenges that have cropped up in the region. The challenges are particularly acute for those who depend on natural living resources and those who occupy low-lying areas in the Indo-Pacific region. So essentially this session, each one of you is free to address in your allotted time some of the questions that have already been shared with you, and you are free to address any one of them across the questions as per your research interest. So we would be interested in knowing what is working well in the region in terms of addressing non-traditional security challenges. And if there are examples, which I'm sure there are, of things that are working well, then the idea is to also try and understand how these successful elements came about and whether they can be replicated, and if there are additional challenges in replication. And what are the other challenges besides global warming and climate change that the region needs to look at? Possibly there isn't enough attention being directed towards those. And of course, we have seen time and again armed forces help being sought in responding to high-intensity weather events or other disastrous events that strike the region from time to time. And these armed forces respond very effectively. Domestically, it's not so much of a challenge, but when such a response is across jurisdictions, there is a sense of unease. Going forward, chances are that such responses would be more frequent. Armed forces would be called upon to respond even more. And in fact, India already has a paramilitary, which is called the National Disaster Response Force, NDRF, and which has been deployed internationally as well, where the host countries have agreed. But there have also been instances where unease has been expressed. So knowing that it is going to be more and more challenging, how is it that we address this sense of unease? And last but not least, we would also be interested in seeing or in discussing what could be the legal regime to ensure that the use of the high seas beyond national jurisdiction is sustainable. And we do not have any particular order, but I think it is only decent of me to invite the two persons who are from the furthest west and have made an effort to be up very early in the morning. So we will start with Ashley Johnson, followed by Dr. Samaranayake. Over to you, Ashley. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anurag. And it's wonderful to be here and a true pleasure to join such a distinguished panel of experts. And I want to extend some additional thanks to ORF and the government of Japan for organizing this event. I was asked to provide a few thoughts on disaster management from a U.S. perspective. And this is a particularly timely topic for me and my colleagues at NBR, given a program that we've been working on, particularly related to areas of cooperation on disaster management in South Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific. I was delighted to have Sohini Bose of ORF, but also Nalanthe and Ambassador Karim join us on this project. So really grateful for their insights and to join them on the session today. I wanted to very briefly provide 3 points regarding the first framing questions, those first 3 framing questions in the agenda. And we'll, of course, look forward to further questions and discussion later with the panelists. One of the areas in which we frequently discuss is something that has been done well in Asia to address non-traditional security challenges, particularly those caused by natural disasters, is looking to community-based resilience and best practices as ways forward. As we all know, as highlighted earlier, Asia is particularly disaster prone, and although climate patterns are changing and natural disasters are intensifying, floods, droughts, cyclones are an unfortunately common occurrence. And the only benefit of this, if we could even say that, is that communities are often then the best source of knowledge on how to respond, as they do have mitigation strategies to try and lessen the impact based on their own experiences. These solutions don't have to be high tech, and oftentimes they are not. Sometimes it's working on better building materials or structures, training community members in emergency response, or educating children at a younger age, bringing in disaster risk reduction curriculum into early learning experiences to build that into societal norms. I'd also note that although these local efforts have been critical and should be implemented in larger national strategies, they also need support. And in this recent program, most experts, each one highlighted that one of the critical challenges is communication and ensuring that we have the adequate and supplies that are provided to the areas that need them. And that has a few different ways that can be manifested in how, what those specific needs are based on the specific disaster, cultural norms, the timing in which the response can be provided. And so one of those factors is how do we kind of develop this on a large scale to address those economic and social costs, but also build a flexible strategy that might be able to build on some of these local efforts across the region. So as we look at how can we scale up tailored approaches, can they be replicated elsewhere? The answer is yes, to a certain extent. Items and factors like regional cooperation frameworks, education, policy tools for disaster risk reduction, private sector engagement are all factors and considerations that countries have in some capacity, but of course at varying levels depending on their own financial resources that they can allocate to these programs, government systems, again, some of those cultural traditions that might design how they respond to disasters. And that is one thing that one company that we worked with on this project that's based in the US but has a presence in India, Vision Planning and Consulting, kind of one example of how they're trying to help navigate some of these challenges is to create a database that cities or their governing bodies can upload their own plans to, so that others can search for some strategies, options that as closely align with some of their own efforts as possible. And so that we don't have to necessarily replicate the efforts that others have already done in working to address some of these issues. Another point that was discussed was the Pacific Data Hub in Southeast Asia, specifically aiming to shift conversations from a need to know to need to share mentality. And I think this is another area in which there is much entrenched history, experience, and how can we better identify how to address those problems? How can we mobilize the efforts that have been done at a local level, bring them to national levels, find ways that we can plug them in across countries and make sure that they can be replicated, but also acknowledging that those plans need to be flexible, they need to be adaptable, and that there isn't a one-size-fits-all policy, and nothing will, even within one community, a disaster won't be the same twice. So how can you adapt for the on-the-ground realities that you're experiencing in one place or another? The last point I might make today. And then again, we'll look forward to the discussion and learning from our other panelists. In one area that I don't think has received enough attention here in the US specifically would be the challenge and humanitarian crisis posed by climate migration. So this doesn't maybe get into some of those other anthropogenic changes that you highlighted, Anurag, but I do want to lean into this a little bit. It is frequently highlighted, I know, in Asia, and there are certain expert policy groups within the US that do bring up this issue and try to bring it into mainstream policymaking. But I think for the most part, it has largely been neglected in terms of broader strategic thinking and how we're going to address this issue. A little bit of the head in the sand when it comes to preparation and inclusivity as we look forward, as we look to address and incorporate some of these issues. Obviously, this is something that Asia has been dealing with for many years. We look at sea level rise, coastal flooding, issues that have forced migration, maybe a little bit earlier than we've seen in the US. And I think that's been part of the problem, is that a lot of the impacts of climate change, they have been tangible. A lot of people have been discussing this for 40 years in the United States, at least. But it really, again, hasn't made it into a lot of the different policy circles. And I think we're starting to see that change. One example is the Department of Defense in recent years has been calling more attention to the instability caused by natural disasters and forced migration. In the U.S. itself, as I just mentioned, experiencing more frequent and intense natural disasters is showing the impact of how populations move, how people might make a decision for economic reasons to move states or move countries, as we look at it maybe a smaller scale to a larger scale. And that's when that's something that they might choose to do rather than something that they're being forced to do. So it shouldn't have come to this. It shouldn't have taken us maybe this long to start acknowledging that this is something that shouldn't be just in specialized policy circles. And I think this is one area that the U.S. can really learn from some of its colleagues in Asia as we do, I think, better integrate some of these conversations. And I do think we're in a slightly better place, at least here in the U.S., to build in and have a consensus on some of these issues, build this into national strategies, international strategies. I know this is something that's being discussed at COP26, and I think I'm a little bit more optimistic that this is something that might kind of factor in. But we still, of course, have a long ways to go here in the U.S. in particular, of just making that part of our own plans to address the climate challenge. There is a lot that we can, of course, continue to discuss here, but I think I'll stop there, Anurag, and I'll turn to, I guess, Nilanthi next.
Yes, please. Nilanthi. Thank you, Ashley.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Anurag, and my thanks to ORF for the invitation to participate today in this important conference. I was really pleased to see the topic of our panel. Essentially, we've seen a lot of attention to the rise of traditional security concerns or state-based security, but a lot of this topic resides in the what-if space. What if China were to do X? Or there is US-China competition. What does that mean for country Y? And this is all certainly important to examine, but when we're discussing non-traditional security challenges or issues that go beyond purely state-based conceptions of security, we already know that we're not talking about what if, but when. There is a certain inevitability of non-traditional security challenges and really a recurrence of these. And in particular, where our conference is situated in Kolkata, there is a recurrence in the Bay of Bengal of issues such as cyclones and the effects of flooding. And we've seen this in terms of the natural disasters and the military responses. So my approach will be just to give a brief answer to all of the excellent questions that Dr. Anurag has posed to us. I'm looking forward to hearing other panelists' thoughts. For the question about what's working well in the region in terms of addressing NTS challenges from environmental change, Bangladesh was the first example that came to my mind, and the establishment of the Coastal Crisis Management Centers, or the CCMCs. As essentially, Bangladesh, I think it's a country that used to be known as really bearing the brunt of natural disasters, but it's really flipped that narrative where it's improved its resilience over the years. It's really taken a concerted approach to capacity building, and it's actually now really become a more increasingly a provider of disaster relief. And we've seen that with in the Bay of Bengal, with Bangladesh delivering relief after the 2016 Sri Lanka floods and landslides, also after delivering relief to Maldives after the 2014 water crisis. So one of the questions is talking about, essentially how do these successful arrangements come about? I think it's important to think about the role of partners in this equation. For example, in Maldives, the construction of the seawall around Male to protect the capital and this vulnerable low-lying population, that Japan was a critical partner in the construction of the seawall. So that's what's working well, and that's one example of how that arrangement came about. I mentioned the Coastal Crisis Management Centers in Bangladesh and the establishment of hundreds of cyclone shelters in Bangladesh. The United States was also a helpful partner to Bangladesh in establishing those. So the role of partnerships I think are really important, including from extra-regional powers, but also India, of course, is well known for its provision of disaster relief, especially in the Bay of Bengal and beyond. For the third question you posed to us about going beyond global warming and climate change, what are other challenges in the region that need to be addressed? I think this is a really important question because widening the aperture beyond environmental change, I think the last year has shown us that these human factors that exacerbate the environment, like we've seen with oil spills, it really illustrates the importance of thinking broadly about the concept, more in terms of environmental security. So if you go back to just last July, a year ago, with Mauritius needing to declare a state of environmental emergency after the Wakashio ship that ran aground, it began spilling oil. That clearly illustrates this wider issue of more immediate human factors that contribute to deteriorating the environment. Sri Lanka, just a few months later, we saw an oil tanker fire and this very long leak of diesel fuel off the coast. And then earlier this year, the Express Pearl container ship fire and its sinking and emptying of chemicals into the sea. Right now, the estimate is about 400 pieces of debris are still on the seabed off of Sri Lanka's western coast. So I think the environmental impacts of these disasters, from Mauritius to Sri Lanka, it really illustrates it's even hard to know, to really comprehend at this point, the long-range implications of these disasters, particularly with damage to fish stocks. But then also earlier this year, with the debris from the Chinese rocket in May in the Indian Ocean off of Maldives, particularly a country like Maldives that values its environment and its location, it's critical to its luxury tourism industry. I think these examples serve to remind us that to think about environmental security broadly and include some of these human factors. For the question about the humanitarian use of armed forces in response to large-scale disasters and how the hosts are not always at ease, that's an important question. I think so far, there are some well-established standard operating procedures in terms of visiting armed forces after disasters and how they essentially need to get in and get out as quickly as possible. Once they've received diplomatic clearance from the host nations, there's a very clear set of terms under which these armed forces can be operating in country. But we still have seen some sensitivities there after Bangladesh, the cyclone Sidr in 2007. India's relief, it appeared to be restricted to the port of Chittagong and the airport in Dhaka, even though India had offered to send helicopters to some of the affected areas. And also elsewhere in the Bay of Bengal, the United States, after Cyclone Nargis in 2008, the U.S. was not permitted to deliver its naval relief. So despite the fact that a U.S. ship sat offshore for 22 days off the coast of Myanmar, the leadership did not trust the U.S. to deliver relief at that time. However, it did trust India to deliver relief via medical teams at the same time. So I think it's important to note, just with these two examples in the Bay of Bengal, there is the issue where even when relief is offered by countries, it will not necessarily be taken. And also the manner of delivering relief, whether it's via the naval realm or via air, that manner of relief also matters to particular countries and their receptivity to the provision of relief. And then to the final question about what legal regimes must be built to ensure collective sustainable use of the high seas. One example, it's relatively new, but came to my mind, is the 2020 IMO requirement, the International Maritime Organization, the requirement to curb sulfur content in ship fuel. Essentially, you have a rule that requires global stakeholders to operationally address the impacts of climate change in their activity. So essentially, the shipping industry is being forced to increase its use of very low sulfur fuel oil. So I think this is an intriguing example of a regulation that can be enacted with essentially global compliance and really benefit to the sustainable use of seas, especially given how much global trade moves by sea and the cost of fuel for ships. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for addressing all the questions that we had in mind for you. And I'm sure the audience would love to hear from the others. It's just that time may be an issue. We move to the very other side, starting with Dr. Anthony Bergen, followed by Dr. David Brewster. Over to you, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Look, I won't cover all those questions, but I do want to pick up on the focusing issue of, what's worked. And I do spend a lot of my time looking at the Pacific Islands, and I thought it might be helpful just to focus on only two issues, to see what lessons can be drawn from the Pacific for the Indian Ocean. And the two issues I'll talk about, IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And the second one is the increasing challenges of marine plastics, marine litter. So the key lesson, I think, from the Indian Ocean in terms of the Pacific, in terms of what's working well, the key lesson really is that you can enhance the effectiveness of monitoring, control, surveillance, enforcement, if you work together, if you cooperate with other coastal states. So I think the target message from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean on this issue is, as a region, you're stronger together. Let me just list some areas that I think specifically are worth picking up on in the Indian Ocean from the Pacific experience in combating IUU fishing. I think there's a significant opportunity for the Indian Ocean to look at the developments in vessel monitoring systems that are in use in the Pacific Ocean and data information sharing standards. The Pacific is really moving quite strongly on electronic monitoring systems to complement observers on fishing vessels. And I think there's a huge opportunity here for the Indian Ocean to learn from the Regional Maritime Surveillance Centre that's based in Honiara in the Solomon Islands. It's very, very effective maritime surveillance centre. I think the Indian Ocean could also very well learn from the regional observer program that the Pacific has in place. I think the observer system in the Indian Ocean is far less developed than it is in the Pacific. I think the so-called Group of 16 coastal states in the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which is really the closest coastal state group in the Indian Ocean, that sort of mirrors the Forum Fisheries Agency, I think that G16 group could take up the IUU challenge much more effectively and build trust and cooperation with some of the Pacific fishing bodies. I think in the Indian Ocean, when I looked at it, there seems to be wide variance in reporting to various fishing bodies, and I think the Indian Ocean could learn from the Pacific in terms of centralised data reporting. I think also one of the areas where the Pacific have been very effective is requiring minimum terms and conditions for distant water fishing nations to fish in the Pacific EEZ, and this is to prevent one distant water fishing country playing off another island state. I think this is an area again where the Indian Ocean could learn. A couple of other big ones. Transshipment is a big problem in the Indian Ocean, and I think the Pacific has been wrestling with this through observer programs. It's again something the Indian Ocean could study. Of course, the big difference in the Indian Ocean on IUU is that most of the illegal fishing in the Indian Ocean is in the high seas, not exclusive economic zones like it is in the Pacific. But the Indian Ocean countries do have port state control. They can bring in fishing vessels they suspect of illegal fishing. And I think port state control is something that the Pacific Islanders have developed, and it's an obvious area for information exchange. Another area is that the Pacific have done well on the IUU is that they have an independent science base on fisheries science that informs their management, fisheries management. And in the Indian Ocean, sadly, there's no independent science provided to the regional fishing bodies. So I think, again, the Indian Ocean could learn around independent science models from the Pacific. One thing the Indian Ocean lacks, I believe, when it comes to IUU fishing is that there's no quantification study. There's nowhere where you can actually find a detailed forensic measurement of IUU fishing. Now, the Pacific have done a brilliant job in producing a study. It's publicly available 4 years ago, and it's being updated as we speak, that attempts to quantify the extent of illegal fishing. Let me just now then, in my last 3 or 4 minutes, talk about the marine plastics issue. I think, as we're all aware, this is a growing problem, and frankly, it's getting worse. The COVID pandemic has increased the use of disposable plastics and aggravated the issue. I think what the Indian Ocean can learn from the Pacific around the marine litter issue is the development of a regional plan of action. And the Pacific have developed a comprehensive framework to try and tackle this and manage this marine pollution problem. They've developed what's called the Pacific Ocean Litter Program, a 6-year program that's aimed around reducing single-use plastics from land-based sources. And there's a lot of focus on policy, a lot of focus on legislation, a lot of focus on consumer awareness issues. I think the Indian Ocean could learn from the Pacific in the way the Pacific leaders have elevated this marine plastics issue almost to the same level, frankly, as climate change, and been pushing for a global coordinated response. I'll come back to that in a minute. Many of the Pacific countries have now introduced bans on the importation of non-biodegradable plastic shopping bags. Many of them have introduced container deposit schemes that seem to be working well in cooperation with the private sector. Some of the islands are considering waste deposit levies to incentivise the return of materials at the end of their life. So the figures are quite impressive. 73% of Pacific islands have now got policies banning single-use plastics, and more island countries are declaring a commitment to do so, and the commitment is soon going to reach 91% of the island countries. Look, a specific example of success, I think, is an example with a major shipping company, Swire Shipping Company, that provides the island countries free non-commercial waste, providing free freight to any destination within their Asia-Pacific shipping network. And obviously that allows the empty shipping containers to transport non-commercial recyclable waste from the Pacific Islands, and that's working very well. A couple of other examples from the fishing area. There's been a lot of work done in the Pacific Islands around trying to minimise the use of plastics, marine plastics in fishing operations. It's a work in progress, but there's some interesting developments there. As I said, it's the same on the plastic issue as the IU fishing issue. That is, the islands have come together in a unified voice. And the best example of that was only a little over a month ago at the meeting of all the environment ministers of the Pacific, where they put out a declaration. You can read it on the website of the South Pacific Regional Environmental Organisation website, where they have called for a global treaty, and they are developing a unified position that they're taking to the United Nations Environment Assembly in February next year to try and kickstart negotiations to develop a global treaty around the marine plastic issue. And I think that's an area where the Indian Ocean should be engaged with the Pacific countries in the development of that possible treaty. My impression in the Indian Ocean is that it's only now beginning to try and wrestle with what levers are most appropriate to deal with the marine plastic issue. And I think, bottom line, I think the Pacific can work, cooperate with Indian Ocean countries around regional frameworks, around some of the legal measures, and as I say, developing how to develop a unified position that they can take to global forums like the IMO when it comes to shipping and marine plastics, like FAO when it comes to fishing and marine plastics, and most importantly, the meeting next February of the United Nations Environment Assembly that's going to try and see whether negotiations can commence around a global treaty. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, there are. Thank you for taking us into some depth on IUU and marine plastic issues. And yes, there are lessons to be learned and possibly replication of some of these frameworks and standards that have been developed in the Pacific region. Over to you, Dr. David Brewster.
Good afternoon, and apologies, I'm sort of struggling with a bit of technology here, so I'm not sure exactly what you're seeing or what it looks like. I'm in a hotel room in the Maldives, so I'm going to approach this issue really, I suppose, following on from a number of the comments that Nalanthe made, and to emphasise a couple of points. One is the breadth of environmental challenges that we need to look at, not just climate change. Secondly, the interaction between these environmental challenges and more traditional strategic challenges. And thirdly, looking at some value adds from the military side. So among the key environmental threats faced in the Bay of Bengal, I'd put 4 threats pretty close to the top. None of these would be too shocking for anyone here, but it's worth just spelling them out because to look at the breadth of them. First of all, severe cyclones and severe weather events. We know that Bay of Bengal is really an epicentre in the Indian Ocean, if not the world, for severe cyclones, which are likely to grow, or the frequency of the most intense storms are likely to increase substantially. Second, sea level rise. For some countries in this broader region, it's including the one I'm in, Maldives, it's an existential threat. Will the country continue to exist following a significant sea level rise? For others, such as Bangladesh, we're looking at potentially at considerable population displacements. I think, at least according to some estimates, perhaps more than 15 million people could be displaced. The question for others in the region is to what extent those displacements will remain a domestic issue, or to what extent they'll cross international borders. Third key environmentally related threat is, I would put under the broad heading of decline of fish stocks. We know that many of the countries in the Bay of Bengal region are heavily dependent on fishing for animal protein, employment, for economic security, etc. And fish stocks are under threat from a combination of direct human activity, such as both legal and illegal overfishing, and also a range of climate change related impacts, such as ocean acidification, marine heat waves, hypoxic areas, changes in ocean currents, etc. And the point here is that, first of all, it's an interaction between climate change events and other human activities, but also it's very highly unpredictable. So we can't just simply don't have the knowledge to be able to predict how these different things will interact in terms of impact on fish stocks. Fourthly, I would put the fourth major threat, and this was mentioned by Nalanthi, as shipping accidents. And as Nalanthi mentioned, we've had some very serious shipping accidents in this region, including in Mauritius and 2 in Sri Lanka over the last 12 months or so. The point here is that first of all, the incredible impact on the environment particularly from oil and chemical spills. It can be just easily become a national disaster. Second point is, we know they're going to happen. Some 100,000 major ships, including around 30,000 oil and gas tankers, pass by the Bay of Bengal area every year. We know almost certainly that some are going to come to grief and that oil spills will occur. So we need to be talking about them, how to deal with them right now. My second area that I wanted to discuss or just mention was the interaction between environmentally related threats and more what we would consider to be strategic consequences. And this is an important point because we need to avoid boxing in environmental issues as simply environmental. As again, I think as Nalanthi may have mentioned, they have much broader consequences, and many of them we can't predict. And probably the best way is just illustrations on this. Somali piracy essentially arose in the 2000s from overfishing by extra-regional fishers taking advantage of the collapse of governance in Somalia and destroying fish stocks there. We saw local fishermen turning to piracy to secure their livelihoods. As a consequence of that, the militarization of the Western Indian Ocean and such things as the Chinese naval base at Djibouti. So we have a string of consequences coming from an environmentally related issue to a strategic issue. there's a number of other interesting examples, one of them being the 2004 tsunami, where we saw, for example, the tsunami effectively ending the civil insurgency in Aceh province, Indonesia, on the one hand, but on the other hand, effectively restarting the civil conflict in Sri Lanka. So not only do these events have strategic or consequences, but they can be terribly, terribly unpredictable. No one before the tsunami really could have predicted that those things would have come or occurred as a consequence of the tsunami. So I'll now, just in my last few minutes, I'll mention regional responses to these threats, and starting with the proposition that the Indian Ocean has very, very little regional or few regional arrangements of any effectiveness to respond to these environmental threats. We saw that in spades in Mauritius last year, when there are a number of countries offering considerable assistance to Mauritius to deal with the oil spill, but in a completely uncoordinated way. They were falling over themselves and duplicating their efforts, etc. And that just simply reflects that there was no prior arrangements for the relevant countries to provide assistance. In this respect, I wanted to mention the Pacific Environmental Security Partnership, which is an arrangement sponsored by Indo-PACOM, US Indo-PACOM, which is intended to bring together, first of all, militaries right around the Indo-Pacific region, or at least the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility, to discuss about their capabilities and their perspectives on environmental threats. But just as importantly, also, it brings in civil agencies. So in each of these countries, they are strongly encouraged to not only bring the military officials along, but also the civilian officials who have responsibility for environmental threats, to so that they can engage in tabletop exercises and other exercises to plan for these events. And I understand that at least in some cases, we've seen that this may have been the first time that really the civilian and military officials from a single country have sat down and undertaken any serious planning about responses to environmental threats. And so that's quite an interesting sort of observation. Now, I think, in my view, the Indian Ocean needs some sort of environmental security partnership or forum, not necessarily on the model of the Pacific, where it's been sponsored by Indo-PACOM. In the Indian Ocean, I think it's it probably needs a group of sponsoring countries who have the capabilities to respond and are able to help organise the region to talk about, first of all, perspectives on climate change and other environmental threats, but also concrete mitigation and response measures that can be undertaken when the next environmental disaster occurs. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Is Ambassador Karim back? Oh, yes, he is. Sir, I would personally prefer that you come last, but I mean, I'm hoping that you're not hard-pressed for time and that you will have to move away. If that is okay with you, I would like Julius to come in at this time.
That's okay. But I have to leave around 4:30 because I have another appointment soon after.
I'll let you go by that time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Julius, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me focus first on the region that is very important if we discuss the Indo-Pacific, and that I'm referring to the Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian region. And let me focus on a very specific marine environmental issue that has been challenging and threatening to societies and all nations of Southeast Asia, and that is the marine plastic pollution. The first part of my discussion concentrates on the extent of the marine plastic pollution problem in Southeast Asia. And the second one will be what has been done so far at the regional level in addressing the marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. So, okay, let me cite some numbers so we will have concrete ideas of the extent of the problem of plastic waste pollution in the region. According to the ASEAN Secretariat, 6 of the 10 ASEAN countries generated more than 31 million tons of plastic waste every year. And at present, it is estimated that 53% of the waste generated in the region is uncollected. Of the waste that is collected, less than a quarter is recycled. And the remaining quantities are either illegally dumped after collection, that's around 34% of the collected waste, or treated and disposed of. Taking into account the population in these 6 countries, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Yeah, so the share of plastics in the form of municipal plastic waste could be estimated that it's 31.7 million tons generated. Okay, so 10 rivers in the world contribute 90% of plastic waste that are washed to the ocean, and 8 of them are in Asia. The Mekong River in mainland Southeast Asia is among these plastic polluted rivers, mainly due to the inadequate waste management systems in countries where the Mekong flows. Major rivers from Indonesia and the Philippines also carry large volumes of plastic waste. The Manila's Pasig River, for instance, dumps over 63,000 tons of plastics into the ocean every year, making it the world's 8th largest contributor of ocean plastic. 4 of Indonesia's rivers are among the 20 most polluted in the world due to mismanaged plastic waste. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as Anthony mentioned earlier, there's a strong impact of the pandemic on the volume of plastic waste generated in Southeast Asia and logically flowed into the oceans. So the sudden increase in single-use plastics and personal protective equipment during the pandemic has put additional stress on countries working to tackle marine plastic debris. In the region, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia have seen a surge in plastic waste as environmental awareness takes a backseat to health concerns. And there has been also a heavy reliance on food delivery services, online shopping, as well as disposable PPEs and face masks amid the pandemic, while recycling has dropped off. In Thailand, plastic waste jumped from 5,500 tons per day before the pandemic to 6,300 tons as of May 2020. During Singapore's circuit breaker lockdown from April to June 2020, an extra 1,334 tons of plastic waste, enough to fill 92 double-decker buses, were produced from takeaway and delivered meals. Malaysia's medical waste, including PPEs, gloves, and swab test tools, surged 27% in March 2020 month-on-month, followed by a 31.5% increase in April and 24.6% climb in May. Now, another main issue that contributes to marine plastic problem in Southeast Asia is the issue of recycling. So in a study of the recent studies made by World Bank, there has been untapped economic opportunities to promote plastic circularity and address marine debris in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. The country studies made by the World Bank found that less than a quarter of plastics available for recycling in Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand are being recycled into valuable materials. And more than 75% of the material value of the plastics is lost, the equivalent of $6 billion per year across the three countries alone. So mismanaged plastic waste in these countries is threatening key economic sectors such as tourism and fisheries and impacting livelihoods and infrastructure. But there's a strong government momentum in these countries to identify critical policies and craft roadmaps to strengthen demand for all recycled plastic resins, level the playing field for global and domestic companies, and help drive a circular economy for plastics. So in my study on national action frameworks on addressing marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia, almost all countries in the region have some kind of a national action plan or national strategies in reducing their marine plastic waste. So Southeast Asian countries are not blind. They recognize that these problems and that they recognize that they are one among the major contributors of ocean plastic pollution globally. Now, the problem with these national action plans and national strategies, they are not legally binding. I am not legally obliged to follow these national action plans because they are not yet legislative, in the form of legislative frameworks. So that's at the national level, there is no single-use plastic ban that is being enforced. What we are observing right now is that some companies and some universities, for example, in my university, they are charging us like extra cents in using single-use plastics. So 10 cents, 20 cents, Singapore dollars. And that's nothing. For me, it's almost as free as before. So, and then the pandemic came, so these national action plans would logically be taken to a backseat. But thankfully, this year, there has been a regional momentum in terms of adopting the ASEAN Regional Action Plan on combating marine plastic pollution. And drawing from inputs from regional stakeholders and the 10 ASEAN member states, the Regional Action Plan proposes an integrated approach to address marine plastic pollution in ASEAN over the next five years, so from 2021 to 2025, through 14 regional action plans at three key stages of the plastic value chain. Number one is to reduce inputs into the system. Number two is to enhance collection and minimize leakage. And number three, create value for waste reuse. The regional action plan supports ASEAN's overall commitment to tackle the challenge of reducing marine plastic waste. And according to the ASEAN Secretary General, this action plan is a testament of the region's collective and forward-looking response to the challenge, with the aim to support regional policies and platforms and align resources to complement existing country actions. And he also said that this regional action plan, which is also built on other regional action plans on plastic pollution, has the potential for replicability to other regions that are tackling the issue of plastic pollution, such as the South Asian region and the Pacific Island region. Now, let me quickly highlight what has been done to complement this regional action plan. There has been joint capacity building exercises in the region to address the plastic pollution. I think one noteworthy capacity building project is the ASEAN-Norway Cooperation Project on local capacity building for reducing plastic pollution in the ASEAN region, or ASEANO project, which commenced in 2019. And it's a $3 million project of Norway in the ASEAN region, mainly focuses on capacity and knowledge development in tackling plastic pollution in the ASEAN region. So it supports knowledge generation and research in the region. For example, it has a partnership with an Indonesian think tank, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, in an effort to find new solutions and innovative approaches to the problem of plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Another donor country that supports the ASEAN region's fight against plastic pollution is South Korea. So it has a lot of national, it has a lot of bilateral projects with individual ASEAN member states in increasing their capacity to reduce marine plastic waste. And also Japan, the government of Japan, it has a project called the promotion of countermeasures against marine plastic litter in Southeast Asia and India. It was officially launched in May 2019, aiming to identify a region-based model for monitoring and assessment of plastic leakage and pollution reduction. And let me also highlight this new institution.
Julius, I will have to request you to be brief at this time.
Yes, thank you. So let me highlight this one important knowledge center that was established in Southeast Asia. This regional knowledge center for marine plastic by the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia or area. So it has the task of promoting private companies whose business activities help combat marine plastic litter. So there are also some preliminary collaboration and participation of private companies and civil society organizations in helping the countries in the region to combat marine plastic debris. So, and it is being facilitated by this knowledge center that I just mentioned. So yeah, in conclusion, yes, the problem is getting worse in the region, but there are national action plans that they recognize the problem, and at the same time, there's a regional framework in place. The issue now is the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sorry because we are running out of time, Julius. I had to, give you that little warning. Ambassador Karim, are you there? Yes. So over to you, and we would like to hear as much as possible within the time allotted, given the years of experience that you've had in the region. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Anurag, both for inviting me and giving me the privilege of sharing some of my thoughts. As I told another conference at the Naval War College yesterday, when I was asked to dwell on a related subject, it was like trying to distill an ocean into a pond. But I'll try my best, whatever I can. First of all, I would compliment the ORF for arranging this in collaboration with the Japanese. And I'd start with the concept note that you circulated. And my comments on those are that while there are a wide area of convergence and synergies between India's approach, there are also some divergences which I think need to be noted and taken into account. First of all, Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal, we derive our perception from our historical legacy. We are located at the apex of the Bay of Bengal. The Bay of Bengal is the middle bay in the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean itself is the great middle bay in the oceanic realm, bridging the Pacific Oceans with the Atlantic Oceans and the Antarctic Ocean. So in a sense, we, from that geographical context, fall literally in the epicenter of what is now being described as the Indo-Pacific. We have been historically, at least from recorded history from the 4th century onwards. We somehow blew it and lost it about 7.5 decades ago. And that resulted in a lot of other spin-offs which have not entirely been happy in consequences for us and our fellow denizens of this region. So the Indo-Pacific concept is nothing new for us. We were at the heart of the Indo-Pacific when it was not even conceptualized as such in today's world. We are also equally concerned and interested in the several points that has been highlighted in your concept note. They have maritime security, ecology, resource harvesting, and management, sustained management. I'm not sure the business community has really looked at sustained management so much as how much they can harvest. And I know that because when the World Bank raised before us the prospects that Bangladesh could harvest $3 trillion from the blue economy to which it had access, I could literally see dollar signs popping out of people's eyes, which made me somewhat fearful, because we could end up doing to the blue economy or the potential blue economy what we have already done to the brown and green economies. We have to be very, very careful. These have consequences in other areas, and they have been dealt with both by Anthony as well as Mr. Brewster, David, and Julius, certainly by Nilanthi. I was part of a NBR project way back between 2009 and 2011, in which I had to respond to an extrapolation of the situation that existed, basically the environmental and ecological situation, doing a futures exercise looking ahead to 2025. And I said, okay, the way things are going, South Asia will have learned how to live together and cope with these collectively, and it needs to put together an organization and a framework to deal with this. And it will have done that by 2025. Now, this is in 2010 that this was projected. Unfortunately, I don't see us having made much progress towards that. Let me touch on some of the points. And then there's one point where I mentioned that we also have some divergences on the points that you have noted in your. When it comes to the Quad, we are very, very wary that the Quad could turn into a defense-oriented or military-oriented grouping. And Bangladesh is not going to touch that with a barge pole. We are both with the Indo-Pacific, we are also with the BRI, but we are with them, not against each other, insofar as the economic aspects are concerned, which helps us to develop ourselves and be proactively connected with both the regions east and west of us. It's a complex situation because in the end, survival is the name of the game for all of us. We think in terms of national concepts, but the environment and the ecological changes that are taking place right now have to force us to look at seeing how we can cooperatively and collaboratively have a working arrangement which is in harmony with regions around us, rather than go into conflict, because we will not survive a conflict. Now, the ecological changes taking place, Anurag's organization and my center were recently engaged in an exercise dealing with one small aspect of the ecology which we share between Bangladesh and India, and that's the Sundarbans. These are the largest mangrove forests or grouping of mangrove forest, stretch of mangrove forest anywhere in the world. They are there scattered all over, but the concentration is largely here. And after 47, we basically divided them. We partitioned it as we partitioned the land on the map. And in the last 100 to 150 years, or perhaps around that or more, we have, I think that alarm is telling me I've overrun my time. Give me 2 more minutes and I'll wind up my thoughts here. We have already lost in the last 100 to 250 years, according to the maps available from records, about 50% of what used to exist at that time, maybe more. And this is not just Bangladesh, this is both West Bengal and Bangladesh have. Number 2 point, without the Sundarbans, they are like the force shield of Star Trek. They are the defensive shield against the forces of nature, because the Bay of Bengal, is a funnel which attracts the high winds, which also attracts currents and undercurrents, and which has other effects on it, and I'll just mention them briefly. The last few cyclones, had there been no Sundarbans, would have devastated vast areas of Bangladesh or West Bengal or Orissa or parts of Myanmar. Mangrove forests now exist only in Bangladesh and West Bengal, and to a small extent along the Arakan coast in Myanmar. But they have disappeared elsewhere. They were there everywhere. I'm just come from Goa yesterday, and I saw the mangrove forest over there and how they were being preserved. In our part, in the exercise that Anurag's organization and I did, I learned that in the last few years, we have also made further encroachments into our mangrove forest with alien plants. Alien meaning they are not indigenous to that part of the country. They're
So you've been muted. We can't hear you. Possibly you've been
a mistake, yeah.
Yeah.
I suspect that the mangroves elsewhere along the Bay of Bengal probably disappeared because people started encroaching into the mangrove areas for crops which would be cash crops, which would give them cash returns. Palm oil. I mean, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Malaysia basically started becoming big producers of palm oil. But palm oil needs palm plantations. And those plantations are essentially along the coastline. Now, this is a hypothesis. We will have to actually go into records to see whether there is a coincidence of the timelines. Number 2, it has already been mentioned. I think Julius mentioned it certainly. Marine plastics. There is a projection. He is right in the figures. Most of the marine plastics comes from East Asia, flow along the Indian Ocean, go past the Cape, southern tip of Africa, into the Atlantic Ocean. In the process, there is no great accumulation in the Indian Ocean itself. But, and this is the point, there's a seepage into the Bay of Bengal. Now, why that seepage is happening, we do not understand yet. It could be because of the coming together of the airflows and the currents. But the projection is, and that was, of course, a computerized model projection, that in 50 years, the entire Bay of Bengal would become a marine plastic, a plastic soup. There are such soups in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, but the Atlantic and the Pacific are much vaster than just the small Bay of Bengal. The Bay of Bengal region is host to 1.78 billion people, either directly involved or by extension from the coastline. And it will affect all these people, because I don't imagine my grandchildren's great-grandchildren eating fish composed of plastic. Why do people migrate? We have in Bangladesh recently recorded, and I read this just 10 days or 12 days ago, 40,000 climate displaced people, displaced from coastal areas and from riverine areas where the rivers have washed away the banks, so they've lost their land, their homes and everything, and their livelihoods, flooding into the capital city of Dhaka. Now, if this has been happening, let's say, for the last 5 years, I don't have the full details on that, then we already have had in the last 5 years, 2 million additional people in the city of Dhaka. Now, in 2010, the projection was, according to the data available at that time and the extrapolation, that up between 15 to 20 million people could be displaced by 2025. And imagine what would happen then. Already in the coastline, we are losing land. People are losing farmland. They are losing agrarian land. pH factor of the soil has changed. Some keystone species are disappearing. The fresh water is becoming increasingly saline. The tube wells are pumping out saline water. So coastal cities and villages are dependent on tankers carrying in fresh water. And I see problems. The non-traditional security challenges come in from that. And then, and this was again discovered by accident about a decade or a little more ago, we have a dead zone of 60,000 square miles in the Bay of Bengal, or square kilometers. And perilously closely positioned in a north-northwest direction. Is it going to move further north and northwest? We don't know. We need to examine. But what it will do to the fish resources there is easily understandable. It may not affect me. It may not affect the term of the currently elected politicians or for the next 2 or 3 terms, but it will affect their children's grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And unless we take cognizance of this collectively, we are all doomed. There will be non-traditional security threats translating perhaps even into conventional security threats. What are we doing about it? And there are a couple of questions. I will not go into answering all of them. Efforts at regional cooperation have been very, very limited and disappointing to date. We found that the larger one is not going anywhere. SARC was formed in 1985. It's Comodos in ICU, in a regional ICU. The BIMSTEC was formed in 1997. It remained dormant for 20 years, and then recently, because of political will coming together of some of the larger countries, it has shown some signs of revival. However, BIMSTEC, the name could be misleading. It says Bay of Bengal initiative. But then if it's Bay of Bengal, it leaves out 2 of the most important countries in the Bay of Bengal. They are in the southern western part of the Bay of Bengal, that's Indonesia and Malaysia. I would look at reimagine BIMSTEC as a BIMSTEC Plus, and then I would try and get all these 7 countries together to address these problems together. Number 3, we have the UNCLOS. We have the basic constitutional framework for a law of the sea. It is still a conventional international law. It is a customary international law, not enforceable international law. So it depends on the will of the people, the goodwill of the people to actually carry out what it says. We need to be able to, and my own experience trying to push regional cooperation has made me realize that we cannot take the whole thing in one bite. There will be no great leaps forward. You have to try the step approach. IORA, Bangladesh will be chairing the IORA from this year for I think 1 year or 2 years, I'm not sure, is a place which has dabbled with ideas about such cooperation, but again, diverse interests among different sets of players and countries in this IORA region. So I have been advocating that, okay, let's do what we can, let's bite off as much as we can chew. I am existentially at risk of my whole country going underwater eventually. Maldives is at risk. Certain other countries around us will be affected. Humans internally displaced will not remain internally displaced for long. No walls, no barriers are going to contain it. That is the history of human civilization. They are like water. They will force their channel through or find a channel through, and they will go where they can survive. So this then does not become just a problem for Bangladesh or for the countries around it. It becomes a larger global issue. And that is why there is all the more reason for us to wake up now and come out of our somnolence. I will end my remarks there. One can say much more, and I hope that these points you can debate a little bit more. I will hang around for another 10 minutes, and then I beg to be excused because I'm in a very short stay and trying to meet as many people. And part of the reason I'm here is I'm also trying to push forward what Anurag and I worked earlier on the Sundarbans. If we can get some action going on that agreement we signed more than 10 years ago and on which nothing, I repeat, zilch, nothing has happened, that is an indication of our efforts at regional cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Karim, and hope that something comes out of your meetings in Delhi. Okay, we are almost at the end of this session. I've been listening. I've been very fascinated to listen to all the comments and perspectives that were presented. I just have, I don't know if we have the time, I'll just take up two questions that I have received. One, and these are directly, and the one is directly directed at Dr. Brewster. You've talked about the interaction between environmental threats and strategic interests that are important but get little attention. How can studies incorporate the two under a social ecological systems framework? And is there some other framework that might seem appropriate? Is Dr. Brewster there? Okay, quickly, now that we're running out of time, the other one is directed at Ashley. Many a times it is seen climate-induced migration is inextricably linked with economic. Were you able to hear the question, David?
Yes.
David,
yes. Sorry, I'm struggling with the technology here. Sorry, would you mind just quickly repeating the question? It was relating to the form of. Yeah.
It is the interaction between environmental threats and strategic interests, which are important but getting little attention. How can studies incorporate the two under a social ecological systems framework, or is there any other framework that comes to your mind?
That's a very difficult and great question. I don't think I've got any perfect answer to it. I think the problems that I pointed out in terms of both the interaction of climate and other environmental threats, and the interaction with that in a strategic sense, was pointing out the unpredictability of the consequences. So we really struggle to, for example, to predict the impact on climate change impact on fish stocks because there are so many factors interacting. Similarly, we struggle to predict the strategic consequences of environmental threats. So, all I can say is that it emphasises that these threats need to be dealt with early on and seriously before their unpredictable consequences come to fruit. I hope that's some sort of answer to your question.
Thank you. The next one is directed at Ashley. It says, many a times it is seen climate-induced migration is inextricably linked with economic migration. How can an effective approach be developed to deal with such intersectionality in addressing this problem?
This is an excellent question. I think that really, as we look at what's happening at COP26, I think there was a discussion on this yesterday even, and I know this has been a central tenet of a lot of these conversations, is how can we develop a comprehensive plan? And I think this is something that, as we look at each country's own respective economic development plans, we have to consider demographic changes as we look at just aging populations, what younger generations are interested in doing. And I think we're seeing that here in the United States, of how do you adjust some of your own development strategies to account for shifts in the energy transition. We're looking at changes in jobs from traditional energy fuels to more innovative technologies, but also renewable energy. This is, of course, not only the case in the United States. This is a challenge that we face across the world as we do transition some of these jobs. But it does need to be in a holistic approach. What are the economic opportunities? What are the jobs that are available? What are some of the long-term trajectories and trends we're seeing in this? It does need to be forward-looking. And this is a really hard challenge because you have short-term needs. You have immediate needs that need to be addressed. You need to provide social benefits for the population that you have. But we also do need to factor in some of the things that we know are coming. This is something that, as we talk about these issues, we know these are issues. We know it's probably going to get worse unless we take some really serious action. And I think some of that is going to be very challenging, as we do in some ways might need to support from either government programs, which is always a tough challenge. Subsidies are never a favorite word, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to build R&D programs, help kind of spur some new areas that can create some of those better economic opportunities, so that as people do look to move, we've kind of planned for that. And I think, again, some of it is forced, some of it is voluntary in terms of migration, and there are ways that we can incorporate social planning, urban planning, economic development strategies at a higher level in some of these conversations like COP that can trickle down into domestic plans as well. I imagine there are some other panelists that might have thoughts on this, so I might pause there because I know we're almost out of time, if anyone else did want to pick that up. But I think that is the question of how do we mitigate short-term immediate needs with the long-term plans.
Yes. We are at the very end, unless somebody wants to respond in a very short period of time where Ashley left. Otherwise, I will start the formal thank yous, so to say. So would any one of you like to make a quick comment? Nilanthi, would you want to come in at this time? Okay. It's been a great pleasure having all of you with us at ORF, and I, on behalf of ORF, I'm grateful to each one of you. Sessions like these never do justice to the expertise that is brought to the panel, which is the limitation. And given that, we are now in a remote mode, it becomes all the more challenging. But nevertheless, Ambassador Karim, Julius, Anthony, David, Ashley, Nilanthi, thank you, all of you, and those who have tuned in to listen to what they had to say. Thank you, and stay well. Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.